World War I marked a pivotal shift in warfare, unlike anything seen before. It introduced weapons that would define modern combat, and among the most iconic was the tank. Yet, like any groundbreaking invention, the initial tanks were, to put it mildly, quite primitive when stacked against today's armored giants. Their crews, in particular, bore the brunt of these early, often catastrophic design flaws. And that's precisely what we're delving into today. Within mere weeks of World War I erupting, the conventional mobile warfare of cavalry charges and open maneuvers ground to a halt. It simply couldn't contend with the devastating power of new, improved artillery and machine guns. Before long, every side was forced to dig in for survival. Casualties mounted at an alarming rate, giving birth to the notorious trench warfare. No one could have predicted the sheer horror that would unfold, or the seemingly insurmountable challenge of effectively breaching enemy defensive lines. Armies threw everything at it. Desperate charges, daring trench raids, even intricate tunnels with massive mines beneath enemy positions. And from this desperate innovation, the landship concept emerged. A truly creative attempt to shatter the trench stalemate. The British learned a harsh lesson at the Somme, enduring a staggering 58,000 casualties in a single day. Even the most intense bombardments couldn't eliminate all machine gun nests. These hidden threats would resurface from their shelters, mowing down advancing infantry in the exposed no-man's land. So, the primary goal was to devise a vehicle capable of annihilating these machine gun emplacements. It needed sufficient armor to withstand small arms fire, and enough firepower to silence those menacing positions. But the greatest hurdle? It had to traverse the nightmarish landscape of no man's land. A chaotic expanse of shell craters, deep trenches, tangled barbed wire, and thick mud. Simply walking across it was an ordeal, let alone piloting a 1915-era vehicle. The name tank was actually a clever ruse, a code word to conceal its true purpose during development, suggesting it was merely a water carrier. Armored vehicles already existed, fitted with Maxim machine guns and protective panels, but their mobility proved utterly useless in the trench-scarred environment. Through countless trials and prototypes, some frankly outlandish, it became clear that a tracked vehicle was the only viable solution. The next major challenge was designing the ideal shape for a vehicle that could conquer trenches. German trenches typically measured 3 meters wide. Therefore, a design was needed that wouldn't simply plunge nose first and become hopelessly wedged in enemy lines. Spoiler alert, this still happened. We'll later share a truly grim account of a crew's fate when their tank became immobilized and was overrun. To spare you the intricacies of the design phase, let's jump straight to the British Mark I, the first tank to see combat, and its subsequent variations. Before we dive into its battlefield debut, let's quickly understand how these inaugural tanks functioned. That peculiar rhomboidal shape, with tracks extending all around the hull, was specifically engineered for trench crossing, offering a fighting chance with a bit of luck and skill against getting bogged down. Early versions were either armed solely with machine guns, known as female tanks, or equipped with 6-pounder guns, dubbed male. A nod to gender equality, 1916 style. Their weapons were housed in naval-style turrets, protruding from sponsons on the sides. These behemoths were roughly 8 meters long and weighed around 28 tons, typically manned by a crew of 8. This included a commander, a driver, and 2 gearsmen, all collaboratively managing the tank's movement, while the remaining crew operated the armaments. They were propelled by a 105-horsepower petrol engine, located right in the center of the crew compartment, granting them a blistering top speed of 4 miles per hour on roads. Speed, however, was secondary to their intended role. Yet, sitting beside an active engine meant an incredible din inside the fighting compartment, so deafening that crews resorted to hand signals or shouting directly into each other's ears for communication, especially for anything beyond frantic gestures or banging on metal. Speaking of communication, your link to command posts involved 2 pigeons, released through special hatches or sending out runners. Flares, flags, and various other, highly sophisticated signaling methods were also employed. Beyond the noise, there were other delightful perks like extreme heat buildup, toxic fumes, and carbon monoxide. Ventilation was practically non-existent. And when you factor in the cordite fumes from firing weapons, coupled with the concussive blasts of nearby artillery shells, well, you had working conditions that were, let's say, less than ideal. Crews routinely passed out inside these tanks. Not to mention, the engines were notoriously prone to catching fire. So many crews were incinerated while manning their tanks that specialized salvage units were established purely to recover their remains. The Mark I first saw combat at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on September 15, 1916, during the Somme offensive. This untested new technology was hastily deployed to the front, often with crews who were experiencing warfare for the very first time. What could possibly go wrong? 32 tanks were unleashed, rumbling across no man's land towards German lines. Most quickly broke down or got stuck. Only a handful were actually destroyed by enemy fire. But 9 tanks did manage to reach and breach German defenses, aiding in the clearing of trenches, spraying them with machine gun fire. While they didn't dramatically alter the immediate battlefield outcome, the appearance of tanks utterly astonished German troops. Many simply fled at the sight of them, realizing bullets were bouncing harmlessly off their hulls. The immense potential was undeniable, and development accelerated significantly. With tanks no longer a secret, the Germans began devising countermeasures. Some were improvised, while others were purpose-built. The first heavy tanks featured armor with a maximum thickness of 12 millimeters, barely enough to stop rifle fire, and notoriously brittle and prone to splintering. Initially, the so-called reversed bullets were enough to ruin a tank crew's day. The Germans would take their 8mm Mauser rifle rounds, extract the projectile, add a bit more powder, and then reinsert the bullet backward. Fired in this manner, it wouldn't bounce off but would splatter against the armor, causing dangerous spalling on the inside. To shield themselves from shrapnel lacerating their faces, crews were issued chain mail masks, along with leather helmets to cushion impacts against the tank's interior. Then came K-bullets with tungsten cores, capable of piercing early tank armor, soon followed by anti-tank rifles. These were essentially supersized standard infantry rifles, firing a 13.2mm round that could punch through and ricochet inside the tank. You can imagine the grim outcome for the crew. Any near miss with artillery could cripple the tank or rupture its fuel tanks, and a direct hit meant instant annihilation. The Germans also started digging wider trenches and used improvised explosive charges to disable tanks that ventured too close. It was alarmingly easy for a tank to get stuck, turning it into a sitting duck for enemy artillery. So, crews innovated the unditching beam, a simple yet highly effective method to extricate themselves. They'd chain it to the tracks, and as the tracks rotated, the beam would provide the necessary traction to pull them free. Fascines, bundles of brushwood, were also employed to help bridge trenches. While the British focused on the colossal Mark series, the French pursued a different path, laying the groundwork for modern armored vehicles. They developed the Renault FT, a remarkably agile tank for its era, designed for swift movement and attacking from unexpected angles. A tactic the Germans themselves would later master in World War II. It boasted an engine at the rear, the crew positioned forward, and a rotating turret on top. This was, fundamentally, the blueprint for modern tanks. The Renault FT had a crew of just 2, the driver and the commander, who also served as the gunner. It was armed with either a 37mm cannon or a Hotchkiss machine gun. These tanks proved far more effective and even saw action at the start of the Second World War. The Germans, conversely, were slow to embrace tanks, a stark contrast to their approach in the next global conflict. They captured and utilized many British tanks but also created the A7V. This was an enormous tank, requiring a crew of between 18 and 25 men, armed with various weapon combinations. However, it was even more unreliable than the British tanks, top-heavy, prone to flipping on uneven ground, and offering no real solution for trench crossing. Now, we must recount the horrific tale of the British tank named Fray Bentos and its crew. It was August 1917, and British tanks were assigned to support an infantry assault on German positions. The battlefield had been relentlessly shelled for weeks, and heavy rains had transformed it into a sea of mud. To ensure the tank didn't get stuck, Captain Richardson guided it on foot, walking alongside. As they advanced, they knocked out a machine gun nest but soon came under heavier fire. Richardson, still outside, was shot in the leg. The driver was wounded in the neck by bullet fragments penetrating the armor, causing him to lose control and slide the tank into a trench. 2 crewmen jumped out to initiate the unditching procedure, but the Germans opened fire again, killing one while the other scrambled back inside. From within, they returned fire on German positions, but the infantry attack they were meant to support was repelled, and the surviving soldiers retreated. Fray Bentos and its crew were now isolated, stuck atop a German trench. The Germans reclaimed their lost positions in a counterattack and swarmed the immobilized tank. A fierce, close-quarters battle erupted as the crew desperately defended themselves from Germans climbing onto their tank. A grenade was even thrown inside, but the crew miraculously managed to toss it back out before it detonated. At this point, every crew member was wounded and fighting for their lives. However, they didn't know this was just the beginning. They were now, essentially, a bunker deep within enemy territory, completely cut off. The ordeal stretched on for 3 agonizing days and 2 nights of relentless fighting. Although the crew managed to repel attacks from inside the tank, they eventually ran out of food, water, and ammunition. They drank fluid from the tank's radiators and even filthy water from the mud at night. By the 3rd day, it was clear they had to act. After inflicting heavy casualties on the Germans, they feared capture, so they planned a breakout attempt on the 3rd night. The crew disabled the tank's guns, and at 9 o'clock in the evening, Sergeant Miss was the first to crawl out. He slowly navigated past German soldiers unnoticed, eventually reaching a friendly trench. He alerted the British infantry in the first trench about the rest of the crew, who were about to follow, ensuring they wouldn't be mistaken for enemies and shot. During the previous days of fighting, British snipers had actually been firing at the crew when they peered out, believing them to be Germans. A couple of hours later, one by one, the 7 surviving crew members crawled to the British trenches, somehow eluding German troops. They were carried to the aid station, and 6 of them survived the war.